The leather-bound ledger of Riverside Plantation served as the heartbeat of the estate, a rhythmic documentation of life, property, and profit that had never skipped a beat in over 3 decades. On the morning of March 14, 1847, the entry was as unremarkable as any other. At the 6:00 a.m. dawn roll call, 250 souls were accounted for, their presence verified by the sharp, rhythmic tick of the overseer's pen against the heavy paper. These men, women, and children represented the engine of the Harrove family's immense wealth, the living infrastructure of a tobacco empire. Yet, when the same book was opened at dusk that very evening, the ink told a story that defied the laws of physics and the harsh realities of the antebellum South. Beside the evening inspection entry, the number was a chilling, hollow 0. There were no notations of a mass escape, no reports of a violent uprising, and no records of a sudden, sweeping plague. 250 people had simply ceased to be. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed a small village whole, leaving behind nothing but the fading scent of wood smoke and the oppressive, ringing silence of a plantation that had, until that hour, operated with the mechanical precision of a Swiss watch. The Riverside estate was no sprawling, chaotic frontier outpost. It was a fortress of agricultural efficiency stretched across 4,000 acres of prime Virginia bottomland. To the east, the grey expanse of the James River served as a natural boundary, its currents deep and treacherous, while to the west, a wall of dense pine forest stood like a silent guard. For 32 years, under the iron-willed patriarch Thomas Harrove and later his son William, the plantation had become a beacon of productivity, fueling the counting houses of Richmond with staggering quantities of tobacco and corn. Every bushel of grain, every birth in the quarters, and every death in the fields was recorded with religious devotion in the main house library. The Harroves believed that if a thing was not documented, it did not exist. They resided in a world of columns and ledgers, convinced that their mastery over the land and its people was absolute because it was written down in ink. This obsession with order, however, would eventually provide the very evidence used by investigators to prove that the impossible had occurred. William Harrove, who inherited the estate in 1835, considered himself a man of enlightenment and system. He governed from a southeast study on the 2nd floor of the great red brick manor, a vantage point specifically designed to allow him to survey his domain without rising from his mahogany desk. From this window he could watch the morning fog lift off the tobacco fields to the south, track the movements of the livestock in the western pastures, and keep a predatory eye on the cluster of cabins to the north that housed his labor force. His life was governed by the clock, roll call at 6, meals at noon, inspection at 8. He famously boasted to his peers that a well-treated laborer is a productive laborer, a philosophy that allowed him to sleep soundly while maintaining a system of total subjugation. His children, William Jr., Thomas, and Elizabeth, were raised in this atmosphere of clinical detachment, viewing the people who served them not as humans with inner lives, but as variables in a complex economic equation that yielded comfort and prestige. Beneath this veneer of colonial grace and enlightened management, however, a separate reality was hardening. The Harroves were constitutionally incapable of seeing the people of Riverside as anything more than shadows that moved at their command, but those shadows had names, histories, and a growing collective will. While the family discussed the price of tobacco in the dining room, a world of whispered codes and long-game strategies was being forged in the quarters. This community was remarkably diverse, a result of Thomas Harrove's long-standing habit of purchasing specialists rather than generic laborers. This unintentional gathering of brilliance, African-born elders, Baltimore-trained craftsmen, and healers from the South Carolina Lowcountry created a unique intellectual ecosystem. They were a people who had been stripped of their names and their freedom, but they had retained their minds, and they were beginning to look at the meticulous boundaries of Riverside not as a home, but as a problem of engineering and logistics waiting to be solved. At the center of this hidden world was Samuel, a man whose presence commanded a quiet, absolute reverence. Born in Africa and brought to the Americas in 1804, Samuel was a living bridge between two worlds, his mind a repository of languages, celestial navigation, and herbal lore. In his 60s by 1847, with hair like carded wool and a body bent by the weight of decades of labor, he remained the undisputed moral and intellectual North Star of the community. He was the one who could read the stars like a map and the soil like a book, and he possessed a patience that the Harroves could never comprehend. Samuel understood that the greatest weapon held by the enslaved was the master's own arrogance, the belief that the property had no capacity for complex thought or long-term coordination. He began to look at the younger, skilled men of the plantation not as laborers, but as the vanguard of a movement that would eventually orchestrate the most profound disappearance in American history. If Samuel was the architect of the spirit, Marcus was the architect of the physical. A master carpenter purchased from a Baltimore estate in 1829, Marcus was a man of medium height with shoulders like oak beams and hands that bore the scars of 1,000 different tools. He was more than a woodworker. He was a self-taught engineer who could calculate structural loads and interpret complex architectural drawings with ease. The Harroves relied on him to keep the plantation's infrastructure from crumbling, never realizing that the very skills they sharpened for their own profit were being turned against them. Marcus lived in a cabin on the eastern edge of the quarters with his wife Hannah, the house seamstress who acted as the community's primary intelligence officer, and their 3 children. Together, Marcus and Hannah formed a formidable partnership, gathering data from the main house and translating it into tactical opportunities, all while maintaining a mask of perfect, industrious compliance. The network of communication was completed by women like Denina, the head cook, and Esther, the midwife. Denina was the heartbeat of the kitchen, a woman of sharp intelligence who used her control over the plantation's food supplies to quietly redirect calories toward a growing, secret stockpile. Her position allowed her to move between the white world of the manor and the black world of the quarters with almost total freedom, carrying messages tucked into bread baskets or whispered over the steam of the hearth. Esther, meanwhile, was a healer who possessed a different kind of power. She was the only person allowed to travel between neighboring estates to tend to the sick, giving her a bird's-eye view of the county's geography and the movement of the local patrols. These individuals, along with Benjamin the stable hand and Joseph the blacksmith, formed a core council that began to meet in the deepest hours of the night, long after the overseer had finished his rounds and the master had extinguished his lamps. The catalyst for the great disappearance occurred on a frigid January night in 1843. Marcus was working late in his shop, the orange glow of a single lantern casting long shadows against the walls as he repaired a broken wagon wheel. The door creaked open, and Samuel stepped inside, moving with a silent grace that belied his age. There was no preamble. The old man simply looked Marcus in the eye and asked a question that was as dangerous as a spark in a powder house. "If you could leave this place, where would you go?" Marcus, startled, spoke of the north, of Pennsylvania, of the cold rivers and the long patrolled roads that usually meant death or recapture for anyone bold enough to try. He spoke of the impossibility of moving his wife and 3 children, of the dogs, and of the sheer distance. But Samuel shook his head slowly, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "What if it wasn't just you, Marcus? What if it was all of us? What if we didn't run but simply vanished?" That single conversation planted a seed that would take 4 years to germinate. Marcus began to look at Riverside not as a prison, but as a technical puzzle. He began to calculate the number of cubic feet of earth in a mile-long tunnel, the volume of timber needed for shoring, and the amount of oxygen required for 250 pairs of lungs. He realized that Samuel was right. The traditional method of escape, running through the woods in small groups, was a suicide mission for a community this size. They were too many, too slow, and too visible. To survive, they had to do something that had never been done in the history of the South. They had to go under. They had to use the very earth they had been forced to till as a shield against the eyes of their oppressors. Over the following weeks, the core group grew to 15 trusted souls, each vetted by Samuel's intuition and Marcus's logic, meeting under the cover of Sunday services to debate the impossible. The first major hurdle was the destination. The group initially assumed they would head for the Canadian border, but the logistics were harrowing. 250 people, including infants and the elderly, would be caught within 48 hours on the open roads. It was Samuel who proposed the radical alternative that would define their legacy. "Everyone expects us to run toward the North Star," he argued, "but the safest place for a bird is in the thickest part of the briar." He suggested they head west, into the rugged, untamed heart of the Allegheny Mountains, territory so remote and difficult to traverse that the Virginia authorities rarely ventured there. If they could find a hidden valley, they could establish a settlement that existed in the blind spots of the maps. They wouldn't be fugitives in a foreign land. They would be a sovereign people in a secret one. The idea was terrifying, yet it was the only plan that offered the possibility of staying together as a community. By the spring of 1844, the planning phase shifted into the labor of the earth. Marcus identified the entrance point for their subterranean highway, his own cabin. As a reward for his years of service, the Harroves had allowed Marcus to install a wooden floor in his home, a rare luxury intended to showcase the benefits of hard work. Beneath those floorboards, Marcus and Joseph the blacksmith began to excavate a vertical shaft, digging 12 feet straight down into the heavy Virginia clay before turning horizontally. They had to move in total silence, using hand-forged tools that Joseph had muffled with leather and grease. The sheer audacity of the task was staggering. They were attempting to dig a tunnel nearly a third of a mile long, tall enough for a man to walk through in a crouch, all while maintaining the grueling pace of their daily plantation labor. It was a project that required not just muscle, but a level of psychological fortitude that bordered on the superhuman. The disposal of the earth became a masterclass in deception. Every morning, the men who had spent the night digging emerged with bags of bright red clay hidden beneath their work clothes. This earth was then systematically dispersed across the plantation's 4,000 acres. It was mixed into the high-nutrient soil of the vegetable gardens, spread thin across the tobacco rows during the turning of the soil, and dumped into the deep center of the compost heaps. To the overseer, it just looked like dirt. He lacked the imagination to see it as the discarded remains of a prison wall. For 4 years, the community of Riverside lived a double life. By day, they were the enlightened property of William Harrove, obediently following the tick of his clock. By night, they were a secret society of miners and engineers, carving a path to a future that the ledger books said they were never meant to have. By the turn of 1846, the subterranean passage had become a living entity, stretching over 800 feet toward a hidden ravine near the riverbanks. It was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering that would have baffled the finest military minds of the era. To prevent the heavy Virginia clay from collapsing under the weight of the plantation's daily commerce, Marcus and Joseph had installed a series of timber frames, scavenged from the forest under the guise of firewood or repairs for the tobacco barns. The air inside the shaft was a thick, stagnant soup that burned the lungs of the diggers, necessitating a ventilation system so subtle it was invisible to the naked eye. Marcus used hollowed-out reeds, joined together and threaded upward through the soil until they reached the surface in areas of dense briar and undergrowth. From above, they appeared as nothing more than the natural debris of the forest floor, but below, they provided the precious, thin stream of oxygen that kept the dream of freedom breathing. Each night, the workers labored in a rhythmic, oxygen-deprived trance, their ears tuned to the vibrations of the ground above, terrified that a sudden rain or an unusually heavy wagon might trigger a cave-in that would bury their hopes forever. The tunnel was more than a path. It was a testament to the community's refusal to be defined by the horizontal boundaries of their enslavement, a vertical rebellion that grew inch by grueling inch beneath the very feet of their masters. While the tunnelers worked in the dark, the women of Riverside operated a logistical network that was equally vital to the mission's success. Denina, the matriarch of the kitchen, had spent years perfecting the art of the invisible surplus. Every barrel of flour and side of smoked bacon that entered the manor house was subjected to a tiny, unnoticeable tax, a handful of grain here, a strip of salted meat there. Over months, these microscopic thefts accumulated into a massive stockpile of high-energy provisions, dried and packed into waterproof bundles that Joseph had fashioned from scrap tin and leather. Simultaneously, Hannah and her sewing circle were manufacturing a wardrobe of freedom. They utilized the discarded scraps from the Harrove family's lavish garments to reinforce the sturdy, homespun clothes of the field workers, adding hidden pockets and waterproof linings. Esther the healer was arguably the most mobile of the conspirators, using her rounds as a midwife to cache medicine and bandages at various points along the proposed escape route. She harvested wild ginger for nausea, willow bark for pain, and concocted salves for the inevitable blisters and infections that would plague a 250-person march. This was not a desperate flight. It was a mobilized society, moving with the accumulated resources of a people who had been planning their own resurrection for more than 1,000 days. The transmission of the final date required a level of cryptographic sophistication that the Harroves would have found impossible to believe. On Sunday, March 7, 1847, the air in the small plantation chapel was thick with a tension that felt like an approaching storm. Ruth, who led the choir, stood before the congregation and began the spiritual "Go Down Moses." It was a song they had sung 1,000 times, a familiar plea for liberation that the overseer ignored as harmless religious fervor. However, on this day, Ruth introduced a subtle, prearranged variation in the third verse, a rhythmic shift, and a specific emphasis on the word Saturday that sent a silent electric shock through the pews. To the white ears listening from the porch, it was merely an emotional flourish. To the people in the pews, it was the final countdown. Over the following 6 days, the plantation hummed with a strange, terrifying normalcy. People worked the fields with an efficiency that almost seemed to mock the system they were about to destroy. In the cabins, parents whispered to their children, teaching them a new game of absolute silence, preparing them for a journey where a single cry could mean the difference between life and the lash. Every folded blanket and every sharpened tool was a secret weapon, hidden in plain sight, as the community waited for the sun to set on the 13th of March. As the sun dipped below the horizon on Saturday, March 13th, the main house was ablaze with light, hosting a lavish dinner party for the local gentry. The clink of crystal and the strains of a fiddle drifted across the lawn, providing the perfect acoustic cover for the movement in the quarters. William Harrove was in high spirits, regaling his guests with tales of his plantation's record yields, entirely unaware that his entire labor force was currently dissolving into the shadows. Gerald Pritchard, the overseer, had followed his usual Saturday routine, conducting a perfunctory inspection of the cabins at 8 p.m. before retreating to his cottage with a bottle of cheap whiskey. He saw the orderly rows of cabins, the dying embers of cooking fires, and the seemingly sleeping families, never suspecting that beneath the floor of Marcus's home, the first wave of the exodus was already beginning. The moon was a mere sliver, a thin crescent that offered just enough light to see a hand in front of a face, but not enough to cast a revealing shadow. The timing was a masterpiece of celestial planning. They had chosen a night when the darkness was a physical wall, a shroud that Samuel had promised would protect them as they stepped out of the light of the only world they had ever known and into the uncertain, terrifying void. The mechanics of the escape were governed by a strict, prearranged hierarchy designed to maximize the survival of the most vulnerable. At 9:15 p.m., the floorboards in Marcus's cabin were lifted, and the first group, the scouts and the strongest men, descended into the earth. Following them were the families with infants and small children, who were given the benefit of the longest period of darkness to cover the initial, most dangerous miles. The movement was a silent, rhythmic pulse. Every 10 minutes, a new group of 10 people would enter the shaft, disappearing into the cold, damp throat of the tunnel. Parents carried their babies in slings, their hands over the infants' mouths, while older children gripped the tunics of the person in front of them with white-knuckled intensity. The 800-foot crawl through the tunnel was a journey through a sensory vacuum, where the only sound was the frantic beating of one's own heart and the ragged breathing of a neighbor. At the end of the passage, they emerged into a deep, bramble-choked ravine where Benjamin stood waiting to usher them into the safety of the trees. By 1:45 a.m., the process was nearly complete, a human conveyor belt of 250 souls that had functioned with a discipline that would have shamed a professional army. By 2 a.m., the quarters of Riverside were a graveyard of memories, a collection of empty shells that still held the ghosts of 3 decades of labor. Marcus and Ruth were the last to stand on the plantation soil, taking one final, harrowing look at the silent cabins. They had purposefully left the quarters in a state of eerie perfection. Blankets were folded, chairs were pushed in, and no personal items were left scattered. They wanted the Harroves to wake up not to a scene of chaos, but to a vacuum that defied explanation, a disappearance so complete it would feel like a supernatural occurrence. Marcus descended the shaft for the final time, sealing the heavy wooden floorboards and engaging a hidden locking mechanism he had forged months prior. As he emerged from the ravine exit, he and Joseph swung the false rock face shut, camouflaging the opening with pre-cut vines and soil until it vanished back into the hillside. The 250 people were now split into 5 distinct groups, moving along parallel, invisible paths toward the western mountains. Behind them, the plantation slept on, its master dreaming of the next day's profits, while his entire world was already miles away, walking through the cold Virginia night toward a valley that existed only in their shared imagination and their desperate, unyielding hope. As the final group emerged from the throat of the tunnel into the damp air of the ravine, the reality of their situation descended with the weight of the mountain itself. Behind them lay the only world they had ever known, a world of precise ledgers and iron-willed masters, and before them lay a labyrinth of shadows and uncertainty. Benjamin, acting as the primary navigator, did not allow for a moment of celebratory reflection. He knew that the first 12 hours were the most critical. The enlightened Harroves would not discover the void in their quarters until the 6 o'clock bell, and every minute spent standing still was a minute stolen from their future. The community, now split into 5 distinct tactical units of 50, began to melt into the pine barrens that bordered the plantation's western edge. They moved with a predatory grace, their feet finding the softest patches of moss and the quietest stretches of pine needles. The crescent moon offered just enough light to illuminate the silhouettes of the trees, but not enough to reveal the 250 ghosts weaving through the undergrowth. By the time the first streaks of grey light began to bleed into the eastern sky, the groups had covered nearly 10 miles, putting the immediate boundaries of Riverside behind them and entering the lawless, unmapped stretches of the Virginia wilderness. The crossing of the James River on the second night became the first true test of their collective resolve. The water was a black, churning mussel, swollen by the early spring rains and choked with the debris of the thaw. To the elderly and the young children, the river looked like an impassable barrier, a liquid wall designed to keep them pinned against the plantation's reach. But Benjamin had spent months scouting a rocky ford where the current broke over a series of submerged limestone shelves. The crossing was a harrowing exercise in human chain-building. The strongest men stood waist-deep in the frigid, bone-chilling water, bracing themselves against the current to create a living railing. Mothers passed infants from hand to hand over the white-capped waves, while the elderly were guided across by teenagers who refused to let them stumble. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic rushing of the water and the occasional splash of a misplaced boot. When the last person hauled themselves onto the western bank, shivering and soaked to the bone, a new sense of identity began to take root. They were no longer the property of Riverside. They were a people who had conquered the river, and the river now stood as a barrier between them and their past. By the 5th day, the initial adrenaline that had fueled their flight began to give way to the grinding reality of hunger and physical exhaustion. The provisions gathered by Denina, dried beans, salted pork and parched corn, were being rationed with mathematical precision, but the caloric demands of marching 20 miles a day through rough terrain were staggering. This was where Esther's deep knowledge of the land became the community's lifeblood. As they moved through the darkening forest, she identified the hidden pantry of the Appalachians. Wild ramps that tasted like onions and garlic, the tender shoots of fiddlehead ferns, and the starchy roots of cattails found in the marshy hollows. She taught the groups how to chew on specific barks to suppress hunger and how to find clean water by following the movement of certain birds. Every evening, when they found a concealed hollow to rest, Esther moved among the shivering families, treating the raw, bleeding blisters of the walkers and the hacking coughs that threatened to betray their position. She was the architect of their physical survival, turning the hostile forest into a pharmacy and a kitchen, ensuring that the fire of their will was not extinguished by the frailty of their bodies. The most terrifying moment of the journey occurred on the 8th night, as Peter's group navigated a narrow ridgeline overlooking a deep valley. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing with it the unmistakable rhythmic baying of hounds, the sound of the patrollers that haunted every fugitive's nightmares. The barking was distant but purposeful, echoing off the rock faces like the tolling of a funeral bell. Peter immediately signaled for a total blackout of movement. 250 people dropped where they stood, huddling in the thickets and pressing their faces into the cold earth. Parents held their hands over their children's mouths with such intensity that the silence became a physical pressure. For 2 hours, the dogs circled the base of the ridge, their cries rising and falling as they searched for a scent that the river crossing and the rocky terrain had effectively scrubbed away. It was a test of psychological fortitude that pushed many to the brink of collapse. The urge to run, to scream, or to surrender was a roaring tide in their minds. But the discipline forged over 4 years of secret tunnel digging held firm. When the hounds finally faded into the distance, leaving only the rustle of the wind in the pines, the community rose as one, moving deeper into the mountains with a renewed, cold-blooded determination to never be found again. As they ascended into the true heart of the Alleghenies, the landscape transformed into a cathedral of ancient stone and towering hardwoods. The air grew thin and crisp, smelling of damp earth and old growth, and the terrain became a vertical struggle of switchbacks and rocky outcrops. They were entering a world that had never seen a plough or a ledger, a place where the authority of Richmond and the mandates of the Harroves held no sway. Samuel, though his breath was short and his limbs ached with a fire that never quite dimmed, led the way with a celestial certainty. He watched the alignment of the stars and the moss on the north side of the oaks, guiding them toward a specific geographical anomaly he had seen in a vision, and that Benjamin had verified on a scouting trip a year prior. They were no longer just moving away from slavery, they were moving toward a sanctuary that the maps ignored. The groups began to converge, their parallel paths narrowing as they approached the final ridge. The sense of anticipation was so thick it felt like electricity in the air, a collective holding of breath as they crested the final peak and looked down into the cradle of their new world. The arrival at the valley on the 13th night was not marked by shouts of joy, but by a profound, weeping silence. As the first group descended the narrow, bramble-choked trail, they emerged into a sprawling, lush basin protected on all sides by sheer granite walls that reached toward the stars. A crystalline stream wound through the center of the valley like a silver ribbon, its water sweet and untainted. This was the Nameless Town, a place that didn't exist in any tax record or land survey. One by one, the other groups emerged from the forest, the reunions marked by tight, desperate embraces and whispered prayers of thanksgiving. Samuel stood in the center of the common area, his white hair glowing in the starlight, and looked at the 250 souls who had followed him into the impossible. "This earth does not belong to the Harroves," he whispered, his voice carrying through the quiet valley. "It belongs to the people who were strong enough to find it. Here, we are not property. Here, we are the architects of our own lives." They had survived the Exodus. Now they faced the even greater challenge of building a civilization in the silence of the mountains. The transition from fugitives to citizens began not with a proclamation, but with the rhythmic bite of the axe into ancient oak. In the early weeks of April 1847, the valley was transformed into a site of frantic, disciplined construction. Marcus, utilizing the same engineering brilliance that had carved the Riverside Tunnel, now turned his eyes upward to the sky. He organized the community into specialized labor guilds, one group focused on felling timber, another on the complex art of dovetail notches to ensure the cabins could withstand the fierce mountain winds without the need for iron nails. Joseph the blacksmith established a primitive forge in a limestone cave, smelting scrap metal they had carried from the plantation to create hinges, adzes, and saws. These first structures were more than shelters, they were the physical manifestations of a new social order. Unlike the crowded uniform cabins of the plantation, these homes were arranged in a wide defensive circle around a central common green, prioritizing both communal protection and individual dignity. By the time the late spring rains arrived, the Nameless Town was no longer a dream of the disenfranchised. It was a cluster of sturdy, smoke-breathing chimneys tucked into the folds of the Alleghenies, invisible to the world, but vibrant with the industry of 250 architects of their own fate. While Marcus built the walls, Jacob, the former manager of the Harrove vegetable gardens, was tasked with ensuring those walls housed a fed population. The valley floor possessed a rich, loamy soil that had been untouched for centuries, but it was choked by a dense canopy of hardwoods that denied the ground the necessary sunlight. The clearing of the fields was a brutal, communal effort that involved men, women, and even the older children. They utilized a technique of girdling the largest trees to kill them slowly, while burning the underbrush to release nutrients back into the earth. From the hidden pouches of their garments, the community produced the seeds they had pilfered from Riverside: heritage corn, pole beans, and squash, the three sisters of indigenous agriculture that could sustain a population on a small footprint. Jacob also pioneered the cultivation of wild mountain berries and medicinal herbs, creating a sustainable agricultural cycle that moved with the seasons rather than the demands of a Richmond merchant. By the harvest of 1848, the community had achieved a feat that would have horrified William Harrove. They were entirely self-sufficient, proving that the labor force he viewed as incapable was, in fact, the most capable agricultural collective in the Commonwealth. Education became the town's silent revolution. led by Ruth in a central building that served as both a chapel and a schoolhouse. In the world they had fled, literacy was a crime, a dangerous spark that could ignite the fires of rebellion. In the valley, it was a sacred duty. Using charcoal from the forge and the smooth, flat surfaces of scrap wood, Ruth began teaching the children, and many of the adults, the fundamentals of reading, writing, and arithmetic. They studied in the early mornings before the workday began, and in the twilight hours after the fields were tended. Miriam, who had secretly taught herself to read in the Harrove library, assisted by reciting passages of history and philosophy from memory, instilling in the students a sense of their place in the broader human story. This was not merely about letters on a page. It was about the reclamation of the mind. To read was to ensure that they could never be tricked by a ledger again. To write was to ensure their history would not be told only by their oppressors. The schoolhouse was the heartbeat of the Nameless Town, a place where the children of former property learned that their thoughts were their own and their potential was as vast as the mountains surrounding them. The governance of the valley was established on a foundation of radical equality that stood in stark contrast to the hierarchical tyranny of the plantation system. Samuel, Marcus, Ruth, Denina, and Esther formed a council of elders, but their authority was based on service and consensus rather than coercion. Every major decision, from the distribution of winter rations to the expansion of the watch system, was debated in communal meetings where every adult had a voice. They rejected the punitive structures of the South, opting instead for a system of restorative justice where disputes were settled through mediation and community service. There were no jails in the valley and no masters. Instead, there was a collective understanding that their survival depended on an unbreakable social contract. Resources were pooled into a communal storehouse, ensuring that the elderly and the infirm received the same protections as the most able-bodied workers. This wasn't a utopia, it was a pragmatic, high-stakes experiment in democracy conducted by a people who had been denied the right to participate in any society. They were building a nation on the fly, governed by the principle that no one was free until everyone was accounted for. Security was maintained through a sophisticated network of watchers, a rotation of scouts who occupied the high ridges overlooking the trails into the valley. Benjamin organized these teams with the precision of a military commander, establishing a series of silent signals, specific bird calls, the rhythmic flashing of a mirror in the sun, or the strategic placement of broken branches to communicate the movement of any outsider. They lived in a state of constant low-level vigilance, knowing that their prosperity was a secret that could be undone by a single stray hunter or a persistent patroller. For 2 years, the valley remained a ghost on the map. The community celebrated marriages, mourned their dead in a small cemetery on the eastern ridge, and welcomed new life into a world where the first breath was taken in freedom. They grew bold enough to establish small traditions, a midsummer festival with music played on hand-fashioned flutes and drums, and a winter solstice feast where Samuel told stories of the ancestors who had crossed the Great Water. In those moments, the trauma of Riverside began to heal, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of a people who had finally found the time to breathe. The end of the Nameless Town began on a crisp, golden afternoon in October 1849. The alarm was sounded not by a shout, but by a specific piercing whistle from the northern ridge, the signal for unknown humans. 3 hunters, tracking a wounded buck through territory they had never explored, stumbled upon the valley's northern edge. From the forest's edge, they peered down into a settlement that defied every law of their reality. A functioning town of black citizens, complete with cabins, smoking chimneys, and cultivated fields. The watchers observed the hunters' paralyzed shock, their hands hovering near their rifles as they took in the impossible sight. The community immediately enacted their long-rehearsed grey protocol. Within minutes, every person in the valley disappeared into pre-designated hiding spots in the dense mountain laurel, leaving the town looking as if the inhabitants had simply stepped away for a moment. The hunters entered the settlement, finding warm hearths and open books, but not a single human soul. They left the valley in a state of superstitious terror, heading toward the nearest town to report the ghost village. The Council of Elders met that night under a moonless sky, knowing the secret was out. The era of the valley was over, but the era of their freedom was just entering its second, more complex phase. The second disappearance was even more masterful than the first, a silent dissolution that left the Virginia militia chasing shadows in the fog. When the armed force arrived in the valley 2 weeks after the hunters' report, they found a skeletal remain of a civilization. The cabins stood, but they were hollowed out. The fields were harvested, but the grain was gone. There were no trails leading out of the basin, no abandoned wagons, and no discarded tools. The community had realized that their strength lay in their ability to fragment. Under the cover of the autumn rains, the 400 residents, augmented by births and other fugitives who had found the valley, split into small autonomous units. Some moved toward the Ohio River, others sought the urban anonymity of Philadelphia and Boston, and a few retreated even deeper into the blind spots of the Appalachian Range. They left behind a town that was technically intact but spiritually vacant, a physical riddle that the authorities chose to solve with fire. The militia burned the cabins and salted the small garden plots, attempting to erase the evidence of a successful black democracy before it could inspire a wider conflagration across the South. Into this vacuum of information stepped Colonel Thomas Brennan, a man whose military mind was built on the hard logic of the Mexican-American War. Commissioned by the state and pressured by insurance syndicates that had lost a fortune on the Riverside property, Brennan approached the case with a clinical obsession. He spent months at Riverside, crawling through the now-sealed tunnel and reconstructing the timeline of the 1847 escape. He was the first to truly grasp the genius of Marcus's engineering and Samuel's celestial navigation. Brennan's investigation was a journey into his own unraveling. The more he learned about the meticulous planning and the absolute trust required to move 250 people in silence, the more he began to doubt the very institution he was sent to protect. He interviewed the Harroves, finding them brittle and delusional, unable to conceive that their laborers possessed the intellectual depth to outmaneuver the entire Virginia legal apparatus. Brennan realized he wasn't hunting criminals, he was hunting architects who had simply redesigned their reality. The turning point for Brennan came in June 1847, when he followed a series of cryptic leads and anonymous whispers into the heart of the Alleghenies. He did not find a desperate band of runaways, he found the remnants of the Nameless Town, and, more importantly, he found Marcus. Their meeting was not one of captor and fugitive, but of two master tacticians recognizing each other's craft. Marcus did not plead for mercy. He offered Brennan a seat and a cup of water, explaining the philosophy of the valley with a calm that unsettled the colonel. Marcus spoke of the tunnel not as a hole in the ground, but as a passage into adulthood, a transition from being a variable in a ledger to a man with a name. Brennan spent 3 days in the valley, observing the ruins of the schoolhouse and the order of the fields. He saw the impossible made manifest in the dovetailed joints of the cabins and the literacy of the children. In that silence, Brennan made a choice that would define his soul. He decided that the truth was too dangerous for a world that wasn't ready to hear it. When Brennan returned to Richmond, his official report was a masterpiece of professional obfuscation. He documented the failure of the search, citing impenetrable terrain and total dispersal of the subjects into northern territories. He recommended that the insurance claims be settled and the case be closed, effectively burying the existence of the valley under a mountain of bureaucratic finality. However, Brennan's private journals, discovered decades after his death, told a different story. He recorded the exact coordinates of the settlement and detailed his conversations with Marcus, Ruth, and Samuel. He wrote that his decision to lie was not an act of treason against Virginia, but an act of loyalty to the human spirit. To return these people to the ledger would be to commit a crime against the very progress of civilization, he noted in his final entry. Brennan became the town's secret guardian, ensuring that the official record remained empty so that the actual people could remain free. The individual fates of the Riverside community emerged years later, like stars appearing through a break in the clouds. In 1851, a carpenter named Marcus Freeman appeared in Toronto, Canada, with a wife named Hannah and 3 children whose ages matched the Riverside records with startling precision. He became a respected furniture maker, his pieces known for their uncommon structural integrity. In Philadelphia, a woman named Denina Roberts operated a boarding house that became a legendary, if unofficial, hub for the Underground Railroad, her kitchen always capable of producing a surplus for those in need. Benjamin Wright, the stable hand who had mastered the mountain trails, enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry in 1863. He fought at Fort Wagner, carrying the discipline of the valley into the fire of the Civil War. These individuals changed their names and obscured their origins, blending into the fabric of a changing America, but they carried the nameless town in the way they moved, the way they built, and the way they refused to ever be accounted for again. The suppression of the Riverside story was a deliberate act of political preservation. In the late 1840s, as the United States teetered on the edge of the Compromise of 1850, the knowledge that 250 enslaved people had successfully governed themselves was a lethal threat to the Southern economy. If the enlightened Harroves could lose their entire estate in an hour, no slaveholder was safe. The records were scattered, the witnesses were discredited, and the valley was allowed to be reclaimed by the forest. But the story survived in the one place the law could not reach: the oral traditions of the families who had lived it. In the black communities of the North and the hidden pockets of the Appalachians, stories were told of the people who went under and the town in the clouds. These histories served as a secret syllabus for resistance, proving to every subsequent generation that the systems of oppression were not as solid as they appeared, that there was always a way to dig, to march, and to disappear. The story of Riverside and the Nameless Town remains a testament to the fact that the drive for liberty is a fundamental law of human engineering. It challenges the traditional narrative of the fugitive as a solitary, desperate figure, replacing it with the image of a sophisticated, coordinated society capable of outthinking their oppressors. The tunnel may be filled with silt, and the valley may be a nameless stretch of wilderness, but the achievement remains. They did the impossible because they refused to believe it was impossible. They lived as free people for 2.5 years in the heart of a slave state, governed by their own laws and sustained by their own labor. They proved that freedom is not something that is given. It is something that is built, inch by inch, through the earth and toward the light. Their disappearance was their final victory, a refusal to be a footnote in someone else's ledger, choosing instead to become a legend that history could never quite capture.